At first, it was just a dog digging near an abandoned playground, his paws tearing into the dirt as if chasing some hidden scent. Children laughed, thinking it was only a game, and passers-by barely paid attention. But then, an elderly war veteran noticed something unusual. Something about the dog's persistence that stirred old memories within him. What they uncovered beneath the soil was not just a rusted box, but a voice from the past, a message meant to outlive its authors. This discovery would connect generations, stir long-buried emotions, and remind an entire town that some stories never truly fade. Stay with us, because what happens next will surprise you, move you, and perhaps even change the way you see memory itself. The morning sun spilled gold across the quiet little town, painting long shadows over the playground that had once been filled with laughter. Now, weeds claimed the rusted swings, paint peeled from the slide, and the merry-go-round creaked whenever the wind brushed against it. Children rarely came here anymore. Parents preferred the newer, safer park built closer to Main Street. The place had become more of a landmark of neglect than a place of joy. And yet, on this particular morning, something unusual was happening. Near the edge of the cracked sandbox, a dog was furiously digging. His paws tore at the dry soil, sending clumps of earth flying behind him. He was a medium-sized mutt, around 3 years old, with short golden fur that glistened under the sunlight. His ribs no longer showed thanks to the townsfolk, who had taken turns feeding him, and though no one claimed ownership, he was everyone's friend. They called him Max. Max wasn't usually so restless. He often spent his mornings napping under the shade of the old slide or chasing after squirrels along the fence line. But today, his nose had caught something beneath the ground, something that made him huff and pant as if he were on a mission. His claws scraped deeper, ears flicking back and forth, tail wagging not with playfulness, but with urgency. A small group began to gather. 2 schoolboys who cut through the playground on their way to class stopped and laughed, pointing at Max as the dirt sprayed their shoes. A mother pushing a stroller paused on the sidewalk, shielding her eyes from the sun while watching with mild curiosity. An older man sitting on a bench tilted his head, squinting as if trying to make sense of what the animal was doing. That man was James Walker. James had lived in the town for nearly 40 years, though people knew little about him, beyond polite nods and the occasional wave. He was tall, but lean, his shoulders stooped slightly from age, but still carrying the trace of the soldier he once had been. His hair was silver, trimmed close to his scalp, and a thin mustache of the same color rested above his lip. Deep lines carved his face, not just from time, but from battles fought in silence long after the war ended. He rarely smiled, but his eyes, steel gray, sharp and weary, revealed a lifetime of stories locked away. James had been a sergeant during his years of service. He'd seen deserts that scorched and jungles that swallowed men whole. He had lost comrades, carried their weight, and returned home to a country that kept moving forward while he struggled to leave the past behind. Now, in his 60s, he lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town. He kept a garden, polished his boots every Sunday, and walked with the kind of discipline that never left a soldier. Yet beneath that stoic exterior, he carried a loneliness few understood. This morning, he hadn't planned to stop at the playground. His walk usually took him along the riverbank where the path was quieter, but something, a tug of intuition, perhaps, had pulled him this way. He sat on the bench, resting his knees, when Max caught his attention. The dog's persistence stirred something within him. It wasn't just the digging. It was the way Max seemed convinced there was something down there, something worth finding. The children began to chant encouragements, laughing as if it were a game. "Dig, Max, dig!" one shouted. The mother chuckled softly, shaking her head, before rolling the stroller onward. But James didn't laugh. His chest tightened, his breath slowing as memories rose unbidden. There had been another time, another place, when he had watched men dig. They had dug not for treasure, but for survival. Trenches hastily carved, foxholes deep enough to shield from mortar fire, graves for those who hadn't made it through the night. The sound of shovels tearing into earth was etched into him, and Max's claws scratching the dirt brought it all back in waves. James stood, cane tapping against the concrete, and walked toward the dog. His boots crunched over gravel, his shadow stretching long across the sandbox. The boys looked up at him, suddenly quiet. James wasn't unkind, but he carried the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture. The lines on his face, the steady set of his jaw. He was a man not to be taken lightly. Max paused only when James approached, panting heavily, his snout covered in dust. He looked up, ears perked, eyes wide and expectant. It was as if he wanted to say, "There's something here. Don't you see it too?" James crouched slowly, his knees protesting. He extended a hand, letting the dog sniff his rough, weathered palm. Then he looked down into the hole Max had created. At first it was just dirt and roots, nothing unusual. But then, just beneath the next layer of soil, something caught the light. Something metallic. James's heart skipped. His fingers brushed against it, pulling away clumps of earth until the shape grew clearer. It was the edge of a box, rusted yet intact, the kind of box not meant to be forgotten. The air seemed to thicken around him as he realized what it was. A container, buried deep, waiting for years to be uncovered. Behind him, the boys whispered excitedly, "What is it? A treasure?" But James didn't answer. His throat tightened, his pulse quickening. He had seen this before. Not the same box, but the same idea. The same ritual of hiding things away, preserving them for a future none of them could predict. He knew, even before pulling it free, that this was a time capsule. James's fingers trembled slightly as they scraped more dirt away from the corroded edges of the box. The children leaned closer, their faces glowing with curiosity, but he waved them back gently. The last thing he wanted was little hands tugging at something that might be sharp or unstable. Max circled the hole, tail wagging furiously, barking once as though urging James not to stop. The box wasn't particularly large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but it carried the weight of mystery. The metal was pitted and speckled with rust, yet the seams held firm, as if protecting its contents had been its only purpose all these years. James slid his hands into the soil, levering it upward with a grunt. His back strained, but he managed to lift it free and set it on the cracked pavement beside the sandbox. A hush fell over the small audience. Even the birds seemed to still their song as the box sat between them, relic-like, commanding respect. James sat back on his heels, brushing dirt from his palms, staring at it with an expression that was half awe, half dread. He had seen plenty of containers unearthed in his life, ammunition crates, supply caches, sealed chests in forgotten villages. But this was different. This wasn't left by soldiers or scavengers. This had the look of something intentional, something hopeful. "Is it treasure?" one of the boys asked again, his voice cracking with anticipation. James's eyes lifted, meeting the boys'. They were wide, innocent, unscarred by time. For a moment, James envied him. He wanted to say yes, to feed their imagination, but the truth weighed heavier on his tongue. "Not treasure," he muttered, his voice low, gravelly from years of silence. "Something better." The children frowned, not understanding, but James knew. Time capsules weren't about gold or jewels. They were about memories. Fragments of life, preserved for future eyes. He hadn't seen one since he was a boy, before he ever donned a uniform. He remembered when his elementary class had buried one behind the school. He had placed a baseball card inside, convinced it would make the future marvel. That capsule had been unearthed years later, and the simple objects within had made grown men and women cry. He reached for the latch, rusted and stubborn. His fingers, though strong, slipped once, twice. The boys leaned closer again, eager to see. Max barked impatiently, pawing at the ground beside the box, as though demanding it be opened immediately. James exhaled and tried again. With a snap, the latch gave way, and the lid creaked as he slowly pried it open. Dust and the faint smell of iron rose into the air. Inside, neatly stacked despite the years, were bundles of paper, photographs, and small objects carefully wrapped in plastic. The boys gasped in unison. To them, it might as well have been treasure. James lifted the topmost item, a Polaroid photograph, edges yellowed, but image still clear. It showed a group of children, grinning ear to ear, standing right there in front of the same playground, though back when the equipment was shiny and new. Their haircuts, their clothes, even the faded tones of the picture screamed of another decade. James's throat tightened. He knew that look. He knew those smiles. One of the boys leaned closer, pointing. "That's here. That's the same slide." James nodded slowly. Yes, this was their place. His voice cracked slightly. Beneath the photos were letters, folded neatly, some sealed in envelopes with names scrawled across the front. His fingers lingered on one envelope in particular. The handwriting, loopy, uneven, written with the impatience of youth, sparked something deep in his memory. He knew that name. Sarah. He hadn't seen it in years, but it hit him like a blow to the chest. He sat back suddenly, holding the envelope carefully as if it might disintegrate at his touch. The children whispered to each other, asking questions, but their voices were distant, muffled by the rush of blood in James's ears. Sarah Thompson, the neighbor girl who had lived across the street when James was just a boy. They had played together, shared secrets, even dreamed about the future under the oak tree near her house. She had been kind, with a voice that carried laughter like music. When he had left for the army, she had waved goodbye from the porch, tears in her eyes. They had promised to write, but life had scattered them apart. He had heard, years later, that she had moved away, and eventually news reached him that she had passed. Too young. Far too young. James swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. His calloused thumb brushed over her name again. He wanted to read it, desperately, but he also felt as though opening it would be an intrusion into a past he no longer belonged to. He glanced at the boys, their eager faces reflecting a simple curiosity, and realized this wasn't the place to bear such ghosts. Not yet. He carefully placed the letter back, his hands shaking. Beneath it, he noticed trinkets, small toys, a yo-yo, a plastic figurine, a keychain shaped like a rocket ship, items of no monetary value, yet priceless in sentiment. Each one told a story, captured a moment of innocence. James's chest ached. These weren't just objects. They were echoes of lives lived in this very town, of children who had grown up, moved on, or perhaps never made it as far as adulthood. And here they were, calling back through time. The boys began peppering him with questions. Who put it there? What's inside that one? Can we read them? James held up a hand. This isn't for us to tear through like a toy chest, he said firmly, though his tone was gentle. This belongs to the town, to everyone. The children pouted, but they listened. Max, however, wasn't so patient. He sniffed at the box, whined, then sat back on his haunches as if satisfied with his discovery. His job was done, He had unearthed the past. James closed the lid carefully, securing it again. He lifted the box, feeling its weight not just in his arms, but in his soul. It was heavier than it looked, not from mass, but from meaning. He knew this wasn't something to keep hidden or treat as a curiosity. This was history. This was memory. This was a gift. As he turned to leave the playground, cane tapping against the cracked pavement, he caught sight of his reflection faintly in the plastic covering of a photograph. For the first time in a long while, he didn't see only the soldier, the old man, the recluse. He saw the boy he had once been, standing beside Sarah under the summer sun, filled with hope for a future that hadn't turned out as either of them expected. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that uncovering this time capsule wasn't just an accident. It was a calling. James walked slowly toward Town Hall, the box clutched tightly in his arms, Max trotting faithfully at his side. Behind him, the playground stood silent, its secrets revealed. Ahead, the streets awaited, unaware that a story decades in the making was about to resurface and change the town forever. The wooden steps of the town hall creaked beneath James's boots as he climbed, the time capsule cradled firmly in his arms. Max padded close, ears perked, as if sensing the gravity of what his discovery had set in motion. The morning bustle of the town was alive around them. Shopkeepers sweeping storefronts, neighbors exchanging greetings, the postman clattering down the street. But James felt apart from it all, walking through the currents of everyday life with something extraordinary pressed against his chest. Inside, the town hall smelled of old paper, polished wood, and faint traces of coffee. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. At the reception desk sat Martha Bennett, the town clerk, a woman in her early 50s with auburn hair, streaked silver, and glasses perched at the end of her nose. She was brisk, efficient, and known for keeping the town's records as meticulously as a librarian guarded books. She looked up as James approached, raising a brow at the dirt-streaked box he carried. "Mr. Walker," she said, her tone both curious and cautious, "what have you got there?" James set the capsule gently on the counter. "Found it in the old playground," he replied, his voice carrying that gravelly calm that made people listen. "Or, rather, Max found it." Martha leaned forward, peering through her glasses. She adjusted them, eyes widening as she noticed the rust and age. "Good heavens! Is that what I think it is?" "Time capsule," James confirmed. "Looks like it's been buried for decades." Martha's expression softened into wonder. "We've always heard rumors that the school children buried something out there, but no one ever knew for sure. Some said it was just a story." She reached out but hesitated, as though touching it without permission might break some unspoken rule. "And it's intact?" James nodded. "Photographs, letters, trinkets, a whole box of memories." Her hand finally rested against the cool metal, and for a moment she was silent. When she looked up again, there was a glimmer in her eyes. "The town council needs to see this. We'll have to organize something." Word spread quickly, as news always does in small towns. By afternoon, the mayor had been called, and the council convened in the chamber. The mayor, Henry Caldwell, was a stocky man in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a booming voice that often made up for his lack of patience. He prided himself on tradition, but had little time for nostalgia, which made him both loved and criticized in equal measure. The council chamber filled with murmurs as townsfolk slipped in, curious to see the artifact that had emerged from their forgotten playground. James sat quietly near the front. Max curled at his feet. The capsule rested on the table before the mayor, its rusted frame catching the afternoon light. Mayor Caldwell tapped the table for order. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we've stumbled upon a piece of our history. He gestured toward the box. Thanks to Mr. Walker and his dog, we've got ourselves a time capsule. We're here to decide what should be done with it. A hand shot up immediately from Margaret Collins, the town's unofficial historian. She was a tall woman in her 70s, with snow-white hair pulled into a bun, and an energy that made her seem younger than her years. We must preserve every item, she insisted. This is invaluable to our town's heritage. We should document each piece, photograph it, archive it properly. From the back, a younger man spoke up, Tom Richards, a local shop owner. Or we could put it on display, he suggested. People love a story. It might even bring a bit of tourism our way. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some nodded at Margaret's suggestion, others at Tom's. Then Martha spoke, her voice firm. Before anything else, we need to remember. These were messages from our children, our families. Some of the people who wrote these letters are still alive. Others aren't. This isn't just history. It's personal. The room quieted. James shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze fixed on the capsule. He hadn't told anyone about the letter he'd seen, Sarah's name written in youthful scrawl. The thought of it being read aloud, displayed like a curiosity, unsettled him. That letter wasn't meant for strangers. It was meant for the future. But whose future? Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat. Here's what we'll do. We'll host a public gathering. A proper unveiling. Let the town see what's inside. Share in it together. That way, no one feels left out and the contents aren't hidden away in some drawer. A ripple of approval swept through the chamber, though not without a few dissenting murmurs. Margaret pursed her lips, clearly preferring a more controlled approach. But the decision was made. James felt a weight settle on him. A public unveiling meant Sarah's letter would be seen. Her words, her voice, laid bare before an audience. He wasn't sure he could bear it. Yet, deep down, another part of him whispered that perhaps this was fate. Perhaps he was meant to see what she had written, no matter the audience. The meeting adjourned with plans for a Saturday event in the town square. The capsule would be opened officially, its contents cataloged and displayed. James left quietly, Max trotting at his side, but Martha caught him at the door. James, she said softly, lowering her voice. You seemed troubled. He met her eyes, those steady hazel eyes that had cataloged the town's every birth, marriage, and passing for years. There's a letter in there, he admitted, his voice low, from someone I knew, someone I lost a long time ago. Martha's expression softened. I see. She laid a hand gently on his arm. Then maybe this isn't just about the town, James. Maybe it's about you too. He gave a faint nod, but said nothing more. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, James sat at his kitchen table with Max lying at his feet. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. The box was still at Town Hall, locked safely away, but James felt its presence as though it were in the room with him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, though it went cold untouched. His mind wandered back through time, to days of childhood, to afternoons spent with Sarah on that very playground. He remembered her laughter echoing as she climbed the slide, her daring leaps from the swings, her voice whispering secrets only he would know. He remembered promising her that one day, when the world was bigger and brighter, they would travel it together. Then the war had come, and promises had been broken. Now, decades later, her voice was reaching out to him through paper and ink. A message carried across time, waiting for him. Max whined softly, as though sensing his turmoil. James leaned down, scratching behind the dog's ear. You knew what you were digging for, didn't you, boy? he murmured. Max's tail thumped gently against the floor, eyes closing in contentment. James sighed, leaning back in his chair. The town might see Saturday as a day of nostalgia, a chance to connect with their past, but for him it would be something far more personal, a confrontation with the ghosts he had carried for too long. And somewhere deep in his heart, he wondered, what if Sarah's words held something he wasn't ready to face? Saturday arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that felt almost ceremonial, as though nature itself had chosen to bless the occasion. The town square, usually quiet except for the chatter of neighbors and the occasional market stall, was alive with energy. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform draped with bunting. Children darted between legs, vendors sold lemonade, and the old church bell chimed the hour, marking the beginning of something everyone felt was special, but could not yet define. At the center of the platform sat the Capsule, cleaned but still rust-streaked, resting on a sturdy wooden table. A podium had been set up beside it, and the town council members bustled about, adjusting microphones and papers. The hum of voices filled the square, a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and nostalgia. For many, this was a chance to look back at their own childhoods. For others, it was a bridge to connect with parents and grandparents who once roamed the same playground. James stood near the back, hands clasped behind him, his posture straight, despite the cane he leaned on. Max sat faithfully at his side, panting happily, unaware of the weight his discovery carried. James had dressed in his best, a clean, pressed shirt, slacks, and polished shoes. He had even pinned the small bronze star medal to his breast pocket, a rare acknowledgement of his past service. It wasn't for show. It was armor, a reminder of strength for a day he knew would test him. Mayor Caldwell stepped up to the podium, his booming voice echoing across the square. Ladies and gentlemen, neighbors and friends, today we gather for a truly remarkable moment in our town's history. Thanks to the keen nose and persistence of our four-legged friend, Max. He gestured grandly toward the dog, drawing laughter and applause, and the steady hands of our very own James Walker. We have unearthed a time capsule, buried decades ago, by children who once played in our town's beloved playground. Applause rippled through the crowd. James gave a modest nod, but kept his eyes on the capsule. This capsule, the mayor continued, resting a hand on the box, is more than rusted metal and faded paper. It is a gift from the past, a message left behind for us, today's generation, to remember who we were and to carry forward what matters most. The crowd hushed as Martha Bennett, the clerk, approached the table. She wore white gloves, her movements careful and reverent. One by one, she began to remove the contents, holding each item up for the crowd to see. A yo-yo, bright red despite its chipped paint. A small plastic rocket ship. A collection of marbles sealed in a glass jar. Each trinket earned murmurs, laughter, and the occasional cheer from older residents who remembered owning the same toys. Then came the photographs. Martha lifted them carefully, showing images of smiling children gathered on the very playground where Max had dug. People leaned forward, some gasping as they recognized younger versions of themselves, or siblings long grown. One woman burst into tears, pressing a hand to her mouth as she whispered her late brother's name. James felt his chest tighten. The weight of memory was thick in the air, binding the townsfolk together in a tapestry of shared history. Yet he knew the heaviest moment had not yet arrived. Finally, Martha reached the stack of letters. She held them delicately, the faded envelopes bearing names that stirred the crowd. Gasps and murmurs filled the square as people recognized handwriting, family surnames, even their own youthful scribbles. "We will read a few aloud," Mayor Caldwell announced. "Not all. We want to return many of these to their families, but a few, so we can hear the voices of those who wrote to us from the past." James's stomach clenched. He gripped his cane tightly, knuckles white. The first letter was from a boy named Tommy Jacobs, who had written about his dream of becoming a firefighter. The crowd chuckled warmly when someone shouted that Tommy was now retired from 30 years of service at the local fire department. Another letter came from a girl who wished for world peace and fewer math tests, earning laughter and applause. Then Martha held up an envelope, pausing. Her eyes scanned the name, and James knew before she even spoke. "From Sarah Thompson," she announced. The square grew still. James closed his eyes briefly, fighting the sudden sting of tears. He could almost hear Sarah's laughter, see her auburn hair glinting in the sun, the way she had stood on tiptoe to whisper secrets in his ear. Martha opened the envelope with care, unfolding the yellowed paper. Her voice softened as she began to read. "Dear Future, I don't know who will read this, but I hope you are happy. My friends and I wanted to leave behind little pieces of our lives, so you'll remember that we were here. My best friend James and I always play here at the playground. We make up adventures and pretend we're heroes. Maybe one day we really will be." James's breath caught. Around him, people turned to glance at him, whispers spreading. If James ever finds this letter, I want him to know. Thank you for being my friend. You always make me brave. When I'm scared, I remember how strong you are, and I feel like I can do anything. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope you never forget me." Martha's voice trembled slightly as she finished. "Love, Sarah." A hush hung over the crowd. The words lingered in the air, delicate yet powerful, like the echo of a song that refused to fade. James stood frozen, staring at the letter in Martha's hands. The years seemed to fall away, and for a moment he was that boy again, standing beside Sarah under the summer sun, filled with dreams unbroken by war or loss. Tears pricked his eyes, but he blinked them back, shoulders squared. He would not crumble here, not in front of everyone. But the ache in his chest was sharp, relentless. The crowd erupted into applause, though softer this time, tinged with emotion. Many wiped their eyes. The mayor stepped forward, thanking Martha, but James barely heard. Max nudged his leg gently, as though reminding him to breathe. James reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in the present. As the event continued, more letters were read, messages of dreams, hopes, and innocence. The townsfolk laughed, cried, and held each other close. The capsule had become more than a curiosity. It was a mirror, showing them who they had been and how far they had come. But for James, it was something else entirely. Sarah's words had pierced through decades of silence, reaching into the part of him he had locked away. He had carried her memory like a ghost, and now she had spoken again, reminding him that he was more than the soldier, more than the loner. He had been her friend, her strength. He had mattered. When the ceremony ended, people lingered, sharing stories, reconnecting with old friends. James slipped away quietly, Max at his heels. The letter still echoed in his mind, each word etched into his soul. Back at his house, he sat in his chair by the window, staring out at the fading light. Max curled beside him, tail thumping softly. James whispered into the quiet, "I didn't forget you, Sarah. Not for a single day." And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude lift, replaced by something warmer. Connection, remembrance, and the faint spark of healing. The days following the unveiling carried a strange energy through the town. Conversations that had once been about weather or grocery prices now lingered on childhood memories, and the names scrawled across the yellowed letters. Families gathered to read words written by relatives long gone. Children marveled at toys their grandparents once played with, and neighbors who had drifted apart found common ground. In stories from decades earlier, it was as if the time capsule had reached out from the past and stitched invisible threads between everyone in the present. For James, however, the days were quieter, heavier. The words of Sarah's letter echoed in his mind, like a melody he couldn't forget. "Thank you for being my friend. You always make me brave." Her handwriting, uneven and rushed, haunted his thoughts as though she had written it just yesterday. He carried the memory with him on his walks, through the grocery store, even in the solitude of his home. Max seemed to sense the change. The golden-furred mutt was never far from James's side now, often resting his chin on James's knee, or nudging his hand until the old man absently scratched behind his ears. In Max's loyalty, James found comfort, a reminder that life, even in its twilight, could still offer companionship. One afternoon, James sat on his porch, the late sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Max lay sprawled at his feet, tail flicking lazily. Across the street, a figure approached, carrying a folder tucked under one arm. As she drew nearer, James recognized her. Emily Thompson, Sarah's niece. Emily was in her early 40s, with chestnut brown hair that fell just below her shoulders, a kind face framed by subtle laugh lines, and a demeanor that radiated warmth. She worked as a schoolteacher in town, known for her patience and the way she made every child feel important. James had seen her around before, always greeting him politely, though they had rarely exchanged more than a few words. "Mr. Walker," Emily called gently as she reached the porch. "Do you mind if I sit for a moment?" James gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Of course." She settled in, smoothing her skirt and offering him a small, tentative smile. "I thought I should thank you," she began, "for finding the capsule, for bringing Sarah's letter back to us." Her voice softened at the mention of her aunt's name. "It meant more to my family than I can say." James swallowed, his throat tight. "She was special," he managed. Emily nodded. "My mother, her sister, cried when she heard it read aloud. Said it sounded just like Sarah again. Said she could almost see her standing there." Emily paused, glancing at James. "I noticed how quiet you were that day. I guessed you might have known her." James let out a long breath. The weight of decades pressed on his shoulders. But something about Emily's presence, gentle, understanding, made it easier to speak. "We grew up together, Sarah and I. She was my best friend." He stared out at the horizon, memories flickering like old film reels. "We thought the world would stay the same forever. Then life changed it all." Emily listened without interruption, her eyes kind, her hands folded neatly in her lap. After a moment, James continued. "I never told anyone, but when I went off to the army, she gave me a locket. Said it would keep me safe. I carried it for years, through places I'd rather forget. Lost it somewhere along the way." His voice caught, and he shook his head. "I thought I'd lost her too. And then, out of nowhere, her words come back to me." Emily reached into the folder she carried and pulled out a photograph, handing it to him. It was of Sarah, perhaps 16, smiling with a book clutched against her chest. Her auburn hair glowed in the sunlight, her eyes bright with mischief. James's hands trembled as he held the photo, his heart tightening. "She talked about you," Emily said softly. "Even years later. My mother remembers her saying how much your friendship meant, how you made her feel brave. James stared at the photograph until his vision blurred. He had carried the memory of Sarah alone for so long. But now, sitting with Emily, it felt less like a burden and more like a story being shared, kept alive. They sat together in silence for a while, the quiet filled only by the rustle of leaves and the soft sigh of the evening breeze. Max lifted his head, watching them, then returned to his nap. Finally, Emily spoke again. "We're planning something," she said. "A small exhibit at the library. A place to display the capsule and its contents, with stories about the children who left them behind. I'd like you to be part of it." James hesitated. The thought of speaking publicly unsettled him, but the idea of Sarah's words and the voices of all those children being honored gave him pause. "What would you want me to do?" "Share your story," Emily said simply. "Not just about the capsule, but about what it means to remember. You've carried more history than most of us can imagine. People need to hear it." James stared at the fading light, torn between the instinct to retreat into silence and the tug of something deeper. For so long, he had lived with the weight of memories that felt too heavy to speak aloud. But perhaps silence was no longer the answer. Perhaps the capsule wasn't just about the past. Perhaps it was about finding a voice in the present. He nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Emily smiled warmly. "That's all I ask." As she rose to leave, Max trotted forward, tail wagging as if to say goodbye. Emily crouched to scratch behind his ears. "You're a good boy," she murmured. "You brought us all back together." When she was gone, James remained on the porch, the photograph of Sarah still in his hands. He felt the ache of loss, yes, but also a strange, quiet gratitude. The capsule had not only given him back Sarah's voice, it had connected him to the people she had left behind, and through them, he felt less alone. That night, James dreamed of the playground, as it once had been, full of laughter, children racing across the sand, Sarah's voice calling his name. When he woke, he found Max curled beside him, the morning sun spilling into the room. For the first time in years, James felt something he had nearly forgotten. The library smelled of polished oak and ink, a comforting blend that carried whispers of knowledge and history. On this particular Saturday, its usually quiet halls buzzed with anticipation. A special exhibit had been prepared, the glass cases carefully arranged to display the treasures of the time capsule. The red yo-yo gleamed under soft lights. The marbles sparkled like little universes, and the photographs had been enlarged and framed, lining the walls with smiling faces from decades past. At the center of it all sat the capsule itself, cleaned but not restored, its rust and scratches preserved like battle scars, testimony to the years it had endured underground. The townsfolk filled the main hall, voices low but eager. Families gathered, pointing at names scrawled in looping childhood handwriting. Children pressed noses to glass as they tried to imagine a world without smartphones and video games. There was laughter, there were tears, but above all, there was connection. Every item told a story, and together they wove the tapestry of a community's shared past. James stood near the entrance, his cane steady in his hand, Max at his side. His shirt was pressed, his shoes polished, and his medal once again pinned to his pocket. He looked every bit the soldier he had once been, though the years weighed on him still. As people passed, some clapped him on the shoulder, thanking him for uncovering the capsule. Others bent to pat Max, who soaked up the attention with his usual wagging tail. Emily approached, her warm smile a steadying force. She wore a navy dress, simple yet elegant, her hair neatly pinned back. "You came," she said softly, though her eyes told him she had never doubted. James nodded. "Couldn't very well hide from it, could I?" She tilted her head. You don't have to do this if you're not ready." James looked around the room, at the faces young and old, at the photographs staring back through time. Then his gaze landed on Sarah's letter, displayed in a case near the center. Her words, written in uneven strokes, seemed to call out to him even now. "You always make me brave." He straightened his shoulders. "I'm ready." When the moment came, Mayor Caldwell stepped to the podium at the front of the hall, his voice filling the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, neighbors, friends, we've gathered not just to celebrate the past, but to honor the voices that reached across time to remind us who we are. It's my privilege to introduce the man who brought this capsule back into our lives, a man who has carried both the burdens and the blessings of history. Please welcome Mr. James Walker." Applause swelled, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. James gripped his cane tighter, Max giving a small bark as if offering encouragement. Slowly, he made his way to the podium, each step deliberate. The crowd quieted as he set his cane aside and steadied himself. His eyes swept across the faces before him, faces of community he had kept at arm's length for so long. He cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, drawing a small ripple of laughter. "But I reckon I've got a few things worth saying." He paused, letting the silence settle. When Max started digging that morning, I thought it was nothing. Just a dog being a dog. But then he uncovered something that wasn't just metal and paper. It was memory. It was hope. It was a reminder that even after decades, voices from the past can still speak. He glanced toward Sarah's letter, his chest tightening. One of those voices belonged to someone I once knew. Sarah Thompson. She was my best friend when we were children. We played in that playground. We dreamed about the future. And when I left for the army, I thought I'd left all of that behind. His voice faltered, but he pressed on. Hearing her words again, it was like she was standing beside me, reminding me of who I used to be. Reminding me that friendship, love, courage, those things don't fade, no matter how many years pass. The hall was utterly still, the weight of his words pressing gently on every heart. "I spent a long time keeping quiet," James continued, "carrying memories I didn't know how to share. But this capsule, it taught me something. Our stories aren't meant to be buried. They're meant to be told, to be passed down, so the people who come after us know where they come from. They know who stood before them." His gaze softened as he looked out at the crowd. This capsule isn't just about the past. It's about the present. It's about us. Right here, right now. It's about remembering that we're not alone, that every one of us is part of a story bigger than ourselves. He exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening. "So I want to say thank you to Sarah, to the children who left their dreams in that box, to Max, who wouldn't stop digging, and to all of you for reminding me that even in the quiet years, we're never truly forgotten." When he stepped back, the hall erupted in applause. Some stood, clapping fiercely. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Emily met his gaze from the front row, her expression one of quiet pride. Max barked once, tail wagging furiously, as if celebrating his role in it all. After the speech, people crowded around James, sharing their own stories. A woman told him how her mother's letter had given her comfort after years of loss. A man said he'd found his own childish handwriting among the papers, reminding him of dreams he had once abandoned. Every story tied back to the capsule, but more importantly, to the sense of unity it had sparked. Later, as the crowd thinned, James found himself standing alone before Sarah's letter. He traced the glass with his fingertips, whispering so only he, and perhaps the memory of her, could hear. "I didn't forget you, Sarah. I never will." Emily approached quietly, her presence gentle. "She'd be proud," she said. James smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe she'd just laugh at me for taking so long to say what needed saying." Emily chuckled softly. "Either way, you honored her." They walked out together into the crisp evening air, Max trotting happily ahead. The town square glowed with lantern light, voices still drifting as neighbors lingered, unwilling to let the day end. James felt something shift within him, a release, a lightness he hadn't known in years. For so long, he had carried his past like a burden. Now, it felt more like a gift, shared and honored rather than hidden away. The capsule had unearthed more than memories. It had unearthed healing. As he reached his porch, James paused, looking back at the town alive with connection. He realized that Sarah's words had not only given him peace, they had given him back to his community. And perhaps, in some way, that had been her gift all along. He settled into his chair, Max curling at his feet, the stars beginning to blink awake overhead. For the first time in decades, James allowed himself to simply breathe, to simply be. And in the stillness of that moment, he felt the quiet truth settle in his heart. The past was not lost. It was alive. In letters, in memories, in the laughter of children, in the loyalty of a dog who wouldn't stop digging. And as long as those stories were told, none of them would ever truly be forgotten.